Today, we are talking about the power of a single mentor relationship and how that transformed the life of my guest today. It's an amazing story. My guest is Anthony Luna. I'll tell you more about him in a second, so stay tuned.
Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we feature top entrepreneurs, business leaders, and thought leaders and ask them how they built key relationships to get where they are today. Now, let's get started with the show.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. You know, every week I get to talk to interesting CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs from all walks of life. And if you've listened before, you know that we've got great episodes in the archives. We've got companies like Netflix and Kinko's, YPO, EO, Activision Blizzard, Grubhub. Go check those out. Lots of great episodes for you in there. And of course, this episode brought to you by our company, Rise 25, where we help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And you can email us at support@rise25.com or go to rise25.com, learn more about our podcast Copilot platform there as well. My guest here today is Anthony Luna. He is now the Chief Executive Officer of Coastline Equity, which is a commercial real estate advisory and property management firm, but a really fascinating background. He grew up in San Pedro, depending on where you grew up. I grew up partly in Southern California, so I'm used to the San Pedro pronunciation, but interesting guy because grew up, a rough upbringing, gang violence was around him, single mom, now of course writes for Forbes and has some amazing opportunities, but it was one relationship with a Holocaust survivor that led to so much growth. And so, Anthony, I can't wait to get into that. But, first of all, for you, what was it like for you at the age of, 9, 10, 11, growing up single mom in a rough part of town?
Yeah, I think any kid that has an abnormal or less than what would be considered, the American status quo of upbringing, you probably don't realize it, as a kid. You probably don't recognize that there's anything different about the way you're growing up, because it might be similar to all of your friends. I don't think I really understood the different lifestyle that we had or our upbringing until later in life, probably, more into my teens and in my college years. But there were definitely some interesting experiences and interesting characters that came in and out of my life. My mom, really tried to raise myself, my siblings the best she could, with the resources she had, but there were definitely some challenging times.
And what was it you had, gang activity around you where you grew up?
I think, in much of LA, there's in most parts of LA, there are different times in the history of LA have been more and more gang activity. And I think during my childhood, especially my teenage years, there was more activity happening in San Pedro and in the harbor area. Probably most specifically, there was a black and brown gang war that was kind of brewing for many years. And I grew up at the Boys and Girls Club. Most of my friends were black. Still, some of my best friends that I grew up with. Best man at my wedding, Adele, grew up with since I was in the 3rd grade. He's now a police officer with LAPD. But simple things like walking from school to the Boys and Girls Club. There were times we were being shot at and for no reason. We weren't gang members. We weren't involved.
Where you were shot at?
Because there was an active kind of violence that was happening where drive-by shootings would happen pretty frequently around town. Wow. And Boys and Girls Club would go on lockdown and was a kind of our safe haven during those years, like it is for many Boys and Girls Club members. And the only reason we're being shot at is because of the color of their skin or the color of my skin. And that was kind of a regular occurrence for many years.
Wow, that's so frightening. Do you have kids now?
No kids. So married, and our kids are our businesses. So we're pretty busy with the businesses at the moment.
Yeah. You look back on that period of time, with Boys and Girls Club, there's no wonder that you ended up going into working for the Boys and Girls Club. But before we get into that, you went to, I believe, Chico State for college, which is opposite end of California, about as far as you can go. And what was that experience like when you got there? So different. I mean, more rural, environment, that sort of thing, not as urban.
Where do you even start? So I'll start with my Amtrak bus and train ride to orientation.
That's how you got there.
That's how I got there for orientation.
Yeah. My brother-in-law went to Chico State and he drove himself. And I give my my wife's family a hard time about this all the time. I can't believe that he just drove himself to college because my parents, I'm fortunate they took me to college.
Yeah, so I was the first in my family to graduate high school, let alone go off to college. So I don't think my mom really knew what to expect. I don't think she really understood what orientation meant, and that was normally kind of an experience you did with your parents.
Yeah.
Where they vet out your dorm room and make sure that they're comfortable you living here. So I think everybody was just so excited for me to go. It was like, all right, you're on your own. Like here's the bus ride. But that bus and train ride was, Northern California has these crazy wildfires that happen every couple of years. And that was one of the years in 2007, 2008. I'm on a bus going to Chico by myself, and all of the rice fields around town are on fire from this major fire. And I feel like I'm like driving into the depths of hell. Like, everything's on fire around me. That's raining in town. And I'm like, where am I going to school? Like, this is totally different. So that was my first introduction to Chico.
Wow. And had you been there? Had you been to visit? Imagine you hadn't been to visit. So you'd accepted, you're going to this place you've never been to, which is like probably about a 16-hour ride away from San Pedro.
That's exactly what it is. When you take a bus and a train, the combo is about 16 hours. Normally, it's about an 8 to 10 hour drive. But when you're on a public bus system or a bus system like Amtrak or Greyhound, it's a long ride.
Yeah.
So that was intro one. I ended up falling in love with the town, but it took probably about 6 months for me to get just accustomed to the way of life and the culture, and it took a lot of great friends, and I was active in a fraternity, in those years, and still very close with my fraternity brothers from that time. But it took a lot of them just kind of talking to me about, you don't need to be as on edge as you always are. You don't have to be looking over your shoulder as much as you do. We can walk down the street. You're fine. I was very hyper aware of my surroundings, just kind of growing up in San Pedro. And I had a really good friend of mine get murdered at a party that I was DJing. So that, I think all of those experiences just kind of led to me being very aware / fearful of my surroundings and not really being comfortable going out late at night. But over the years, just getting more accustomed to the safety of a college town and the safety of that town, and just the way of life there was so different.
And I actually skipped over one area of your life that I was going to ask about, because you said that as soon as you legally were able to work around age 15, you got a first job and then a second job, and you started DJing on the side to make money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, California, you can legally, or at that time, you could legally start working soon after your 15th birthday, as long as you had parent approval on a document and school approval. So the school had to annually verify that you were in school and you were, passing grades sufficiently and on the right track to graduation. Then you could work in California. So my first job was at the San Pedro Fish Market. It's huge. It used to be still a very large business, but they've moved locations and are building a new facility. But I think they're like the number 1 or number 2 most trafficked restaurant business in the country. Huge groups of people go down there every weekend to go celebrate birthdays and buy fresh fish and shrimp and have a great time. That was my first job. Tough first job,
Yeah. Messy work,
gutting fish and cleaning crabs and that sort of thing. That was my first job. And then my second job that I did concurrently through high school was working for the Boys and Girls Club as a tutor. So as a high school student, I was tutoring elementary school members. And that was a part-time job Monday through Thursday. And then Friday through Sunday, I worked at the fish market. And then usually most Saturday nights after I was done at the fish market, I was off DJing, at a party or a club or a restaurant. So kind of just stayed busy that way. So
you were working a lot. Were you saving your money? What were you doing with your money?
I was not saving. I was probably, a lot of it was reinvesting it back into the DJ equipment. In those years, I was still DJing with physical vinyl. So, every time a new song came out, I'm buying that new record. Mm-hmm. So between equipment and records, and then also paying for my own school clothes and paying for my own cell phone bill and cell phone. The first iPhone came out and I wanted the new iPhone. So paying for,
and those bills are expensive.
Yeah, those were some expensive bills.
I feel like the cell phone bill is the only thing in the last 20 years that has gone down in price.
Right. Yeah. Those were not cheap. Those were not cheap bills. Those were really expensive.
Yeah. It's crazy. I mean, I paid like $200 a month 20 years ago. And now it's like, like a cell phone bill can be as cheap as 25 to $40. I don't get it, but I'm all in favor of it.
Yeah, we were paying per text message in those days, so that wasn't cheap.
Well, that's true.
So
Kids, you don't understand how hard we had it. We had to pay for every text message. So you go to work, and you actually work at the Boys and Girls Club, and then you go off to Chico, and you end up graduating, and then you come back to where you came from. You come back and you work at the Boys and Girls Club. Now, there are many people that would have just run away after having that experience that you did, dodging bullets growing up, gang violence, that sort of thing. What brought you back?
So I want to correct one thing. I'm actually a college dropout. I did not finish college. My wife will not let me live this down. I'm about 4 classes away from graduation, and I have still not completed them and really don't plan to. I've done continuing education in other ways, but did not graduate. So that's
I think there's a certain point where you get like credit for like work experience. Isn't that true? Sometimes
that would be
university.
real nice, right? Just have a piece of paper on the wall.
Yeah, exactly.
So
when you
no,
deliver the keynote speak or something like that, the what's it called, the commencement speech, maybe.
There you go.
Yeah,
I'll get the honorary degree at that point.
Give me that honorary degree.
Yeah. So
actually, by the way, I've had past guests on this podcast that got commencement speeches because of an interview that I did on this podcast.
Oh, how interesting.
So another EO member. So we'll have to share this episode with Chico, and maybe you will give the commencement speech.
Again, it was a great time of my life and great experience and great professors. But I think with the combination of, I never really stopped working. So I was working through college, and between working, crazy hours at the Boys and Girls Club there and all the other things that happened in my life, I just kind of missed those final classes and moved on with my career.
Got it.
So
and
the speech will help me get there.
So then you came back. You came back to the Boys and Girls Club.
Yeah. So I was working for kind of what led me back to LA. The entire time I was in college, I was working for the Boys and Girls Club that's in Northern California, in the Chico area, called Boys and Girls Clubs of the North Valley. And they operate all the clubs in the Butte County and now some other counties in that area. And started as a tutor, just like I was when I was in the LA organization as a kid, and kind of worked my way through the organization as a tutor, and then education coordinator, and was managing the education department for a period of time, and then eventually was offered the job that I was really after, which was managing the teen center. So I really had a passion for working with teens, especially teens that I felt like I connected with, that had rough upbringings or challenges at home or challenges in the community, and really enjoyed working with leadership programs and mentoring other teens. So that's where I was really working and traveling with that group of kids to various leadership conferences. And it was at one of those conferences that my former CEO from the Boys and Girls Clubs of the LA Harbor approached me and asked if I would come home. And I told him no the first 3 or 4 times, but Mike Lansing is a persistent man. He usually gets what he wants when it comes to employment and grants and funding. And eventually, I couldn't say no anymore, and he eventually encouraged me to come back and manage all of the teen centers that the LA Harbor organization had opened at that point.
And by the way, we skipped over it, but when did you meet George Mayer, and who is George Mayer?
Yeah, so I met George Mayer when I was a member of the Boys and Girls Club. I was about 15 years old at the time. And George had learned about the Boys and Girls Club from a family member that was living in New York, and realized, I have a Boys and Girls Club 5 minutes from my home, 10 minutes from my home, and I want to go learn about what they do. And like George didn't go for a tour only. He decided he wanted to not only go for a tour, but he wanted to start mentoring teens, and he wanted to start a mentoring program and find other professionals to help mentor teenagers. So he started that in 2005, and he's been doing that ever since. Wow. So almost 20 years, George has been running the mentor program at Boys and Girls Club.
And now George is a Holocaust survivor.
George was born in Poland. Survivor, yeah.
Amazing story. Tell the story about how he survived the Holocaust.
So George is a child survivor of the Holocaust. He was 3 when the war broke out, and when World War II broke out, and his parents actually entrusted his life with members of the community in Lvov, Poland, that they didn't even know. They were Catholic and Christian families that could safely harbor a young Jewish boy and risk their own lives to protect him.
Amazing.
Really, that in World War II, in that time when the Nazis came in, if they found a family had harbored a Nazi child, not only would you be murdered and the child be murdered, but your entire family was at risk of being murdered, and sometimes an entire apartment building, because there was an assumption that everybody was involved with the protection of the Jewish child.
Wow, that's incredible. And so they harbored him and he survived the war. I imagine many of his family members perished, and he makes it to the United States, and he eventually builds the company that you are now CEO of, Coastline. And so this man comes into your life at 15 years old, and you actually didn't even know what he did. You just knew that this is this older man wearing a suit. What did you think of him at the time?
So, so I mentioned Adele earlier, my closest friend since I was, since I think we were third or fourth grade together. George was mentoring Adele first at the Boys and Girls Club. And George had partnered me with a mentor who worked for a company. They are now a defunct mortgage company, but they helped to start the 08 recession, 07 recession, called, I think they were called Countrywide.
Of course, yes, Countrywide. I think I had a
George
mortgage with Countrywide. Who didn't?
He didn't know who he was introducing me to, but my mentor was an executive over at Countrywide. And right when just one day I was supposed to meet with this guy, and I show up to breakfast, and this guy never shows back up. And like a week later,
that's about right.
Countrywide's bankrupt. So I think everybody knew what was going on about a week. So that was my mentor. He disappeared, and then George, I think, felt bad, like, oh, I just introduced you to this guy that disappeared. Why don't you come join Adele and I, and I'll mentor you both.
Yeah.
And I think at first, I remember Adele telling me, I'm not really sure about this guy. He's this older gentleman, and comes in a suit every day to see me. It's kind of weird. And we didn't know anybody that wore a suit to an office work every day.
Yeah.
And here goes this older guy that, in our minds, didn't have anything in common with us, didn't look like us, didn't come from communities like us. What could he possibly know about what we're dealing with and the stresses we're dealing with?
Yeah.
Little did we know he knew, much more than we could imagine, and experienced things far worse than our, deepest nightmares, worst nightmares. And
how did that come out? Do you recall? Did he tell you his story?
Yeah. So every year, George still does the same field trip every single year. And every year, if I can, I still try to go on the field trip with him as a chaperone, because it's just that powerful of a day. George, there's a museum here in Los Angeles called the Tolerance Museum. And George starts the day with, donuts and hot chocolate at the Boys and Girls Club, and kind of has like a little, get together, and kind of explains to the members, most of the time there's 50% of the kids are returning members that want to go again with George and have the experience again. And about 50% are people that have never been, or teens that have never been to the Holocaust Museum, or the Tolerance Museum rather. And George starts by explaining what the museum is about and what its goals are, and then sharing his story, and sharing his experience, and his family's experience.
And that's how you heard the story.
And that's how I heard the story. And I remember that was the moment I was like, okay, this is different. This is not what I was expecting from this guy. So to not only hear his experience and hear how it's affected his life and how it affected his parents, and the fact that, there was a period of time where his parents thought he was dead. The home that he was supposed to be in, being protected and being harbored, was bombed by the Nazis. Luckily, George and the family at that time that were protecting him were off in another town, and they had gone to another town to go visit. So they weren't home when the bomb went.
Wow.
But his parents thought he had died. So imagine, parents not only trusted you with somebody they didn't even know, hoping for the best, but now they think you're dead. And I think George's dad found out, like through a friend of a friend, like, no, we saw your son. He's up in this other village. Like, he's totally fine. We saw him up there.
So the parents survived the Holocaust?
He did. Both of his parents survived.
How did his parents survive?
I believe they were both, they were separated as well. And they were both being protected by other members of the community as well.
Wow. So I imagine your understanding of who George is completely changes after you learn this information.
Yeah.
And So kind of fast forwarding in the story, you're building a career basically in the nonprofit world, and now you're CEO of a real estate company. Now that's an unusual trajectory, unless you're like managing a portfolio of real estate for a nonprofit world, which you weren't. You were managing teen programs.
No.
So you run into him later in life,
Yeah.
or you're in your 20s or something like that. And what was that like when you run into him again?
Yeah, so I'll go back for a second and say that nobody grows up saying, I want to be a property manager. No, I've never met anybody in the profession that it says, I knew I wanted to be a property manager since I was 5 years old.
Yeah.
It's always an accident how we end up here. So you just find you love it at some point. But I was already managing a portfolio for a single client in Long Beach with my wife. We were engaged at the time. And I was doing that at the same time that I was still working for the Boys and Girls Club. At this point in my career, I was no longer in direct service. I was more on the grant management side, managing, it was at that time about 13 after-school programs that were on school campuses. So I was hiring and training and managing the grant requirements. So it was basically an office job at this point. So I went from 16 hours doing direct service, where 8 hours was behind the scenes preparing for the day, and then you had another 8 hours when the kids got there, to really like an 8 to 10 hour day behind a desk. And I was a little bit bored because I was used to these crazy hours and crazy days and not getting home until midnight. So I was looking for something else, and my wife was going back to grad school at the time, so we needed to replace the income. So I got into real estate, and I was managing for a single client in Long Beach, and really fell in love with the business, and fell in love especially on the asset management side and renovation side. Construction. And we were at a dinner party. Adele keeps coming back to the story. We were at a dinner party celebrating Adele's graduation from the police academy. And George was in attendance at this dinner party. And the friend who threw this dinner party always likes to have these icebreaker games, or really deep questions to have the dinner party kind of think about and share. And in one of those questions, we got to a point where we were talking about what's new in everybody's lives. We hadn't seen each other, a lot of us, in a few years. And I mentioned that Lauren and my wife and I, were now in property management, and I was really enjoying it. And I was thinking about leaving my career in nonprofit management and to really chase after this real estate career full time and really start to build a business in property management. At this point, I still did not know what George did for a living. I still, my entire life, did not know what he did for a living. I knew he owned businesses, but I didn't know what they were. And I think about a week later, Adele calls me. He goes, "Hey, George wants to meet with you about an opportunity." And I said, "What's the opportunity?" He's like, "I don't know, something with his business." I figured Adele must have known what George did. I said, "What's the business?" He's like, "I really don't understand what he does, so I don't know. You'll have to ask him." So I had lunch with George, and George kind of just showed me his business and showed me the portfolio. And I realized how similar it was to what I was already doing. And he showed me the software that he was trying to implement. And it was a software that I understood very well and had successfully implemented in the portfolio that I was managing. And George asked me to take a leave of absence from both of those opportunities, my current job and the real estate world, and take a two-week leave of absence and be honest about, with these people about what I was considering. And I think by about day 3 of that leave of absence, George looks at me. We're driving back from a property. He goes, "Really want you to join me full time. How do you feel? How do you feel about the first couple of days?" It's like, "I agree. Like, I'm going to let them know I'm not coming back, and I'll give them some time and to replace me." So that was in 2017. So about 7 years later,
yeah,
here we are.
And I read an article that was actually in 2018. It was about George, and it mentioned you, and it kind of described you as the heir apparent to this company. So that's a major life shift in a year, to go from you're working in nonprofit management to working in real estate management. And not just that, this man who you'd known, didn't even know what he did professionally, now wants to turn over the business to you, in addition to, there's issues of how do you finance it? How do you acquire it? Stuff like that. But that's a major life change for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. It was a huge opportunity that, George presented, George and his wife, Barbara, presented to us. So
why do you think he chose you?
I still ask myself that question a lot. And I'll share what he shared with me. I think George always saw the properties that he owned and the tenants and the properties he managed for other clients, he really cared about all the people involved, the tenants, the staff, the properties, all of the relationships. And George, for many years, was looking for a junior partner that would succeed him in the business, that would eventually buy him out of the business. And he had tried a few times and really hadn't found that person. And I think because of our relationship and George really being a part of some formative years of my life and being involved in some of those periods of time where I really had challenges and worked through them, and a lot of times would rely on him to work through them emotionally. I think George had a trust factor with me that we could really share. He could share what's worked best and what hasn't worked in the business. And I think also he saw my background in technology, my background in managing people, and what that could do for the business. So soon after joining him, George presented an opportunity that I could earn via sweat equity, kind of as the business grew. And as I drove the business development and grew the portfolio, I could acquire shares through that sweat equity. So that was the initial way to begin earning some ownership stake in the company. I think as George saw how quickly that growth was happening, it presented a kind of a next conversation of a possible exit and potential buyout completely a few years ago.
Was there any part of you who was afraid of this opportunity? I mean, you DJ'd in high school, and then you'd managed some properties for one client, and then all of a sudden you're acquiring this massive, company. I mean, there's a lot of people who would be like, "Oh, hold on, wait a second, things are happening fast."
I fell in love with the business. I really fell in love with what we do. Again, it's very accidental. When you get into property management and you find that you love it, it's completely accidental, but something turns on. And I found it. I found, the part of the business and the type of products that I really enjoyed, the types of clients that I really liked working with. And in some ways, there were some parallels. There still are some parallels to, working with an at-risk teen and some of the challenges that come from it. But, part of the exciting part of working with an at-risk teen is knowing that behind the trauma, behind the challenges that they're going through at the moment, you can see what they, the goals they have for themselves and the life they want for themselves. And you're really just trying to help them get there and give them the mentorship and give them the tools and give them the introductions to the right people, the right programs so that they can achieve those goals. And in some ways, the type of real estate we do is value add, value add reconstruction and property management of commercial assets. A lot of ways, that's kind of what you're doing. You're getting an asset from a client, or you're buying an asset for an investor that you can see what it can become, but it's not there yet. And it's got some, trauma. It's got some damage. It's got some issues. It's got some problems with accounting, or has problems with the construction issues. So I really enjoy working with that kind of product.
That's interesting. That's there's a really interesting parallel between your background, your story, the work that you did with the Boys and Girls Club, and how it makes sense to the work that you do today. This has been great. Really interesting hearing your background, hearing your story. I'd love for people to know where they can go to learn more about you and connect with you, Anthony.
Yeah, absolutely. So probably the best place to connect with me, where I'm most active, is LinkedIn. So Anthony A. Luna on LinkedIn. I'm also fairly active on Instagram and post there pretty regularly. So same thing, it's Anthony A. Luna, but there's an underscore between the A on either side. And then also on Forbes. I'm a Forbes contributor. So if they Google Anthony A. Luna, they'll find those Forbes articles and other publications that I've been a part of.
And by the way, I just realized I completely skipped over my gratitude question, but I think we know the answer, at least of one person who you would be grateful to. But I want to give you that opportunity. Are there any particular people that you would want to shout out and thank, George or others?
I think the overarching is really the Boys and Girls Club movement in general. I think if it weren't for the Boys and Girls Club and the experiences that I had and the people that I was introduced to, George Mayer being the most pivotal in my life and life-changing has been George Mayer. But there are many people that I was introduced to that were either mentors at the Boys and Girls Club or staff people that work there. Mike Lansing has been a huge mentor in my career in the nonprofit world. But even now, as I serve on the board of directors, he's been the CEO of the Boys and Girls Clubs of the LA Harbor for going on 30 years. And he's retiring this year, and it would be a mistake not to thank Mike and all the work he's done for me, but so many of my friends and neighbors in San Pedro throughout the harbor area. And can go on. There's many people at the Boys and Girls Club that were really life-changing because of the mentorship and the care and love they provided to me and so many people like me at the club.
Anthony, thanks so much.
Thanks, John.
Thanks for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.